This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news. The Bloomberg Businessweek podcast with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec from Bloomberg Radio.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Bloomberg Businessweek Weekend podcast. This week, we are diving deep into some of the major geopolitical tensions of our time, including the ongoing tensions in the relationship between the U.S. and China. One key driver of that stress, Taiwan. We catch up with the author of The Struggle for Taiwan in just a moment.
Meantime, Russian President Vladimir Putin visiting Chinese President Xi Jinping, underlining the vital importance of the relationship as Beijing faces growing U.S. pressure to curtail support that's helping Moscow continue its war in Ukraine. The two pledging to intensify cooperation against U.S. containment of their countries. A new novel out takes us back to Moscow in the early 1990s and to what might have been when it comes to Russia's historical path.
And then there is the Middle East, which has played out in numerous protests on college campuses by pro-Palestinian students and groups, which have been largely shut down ahead of recent college graduation. Well, it got us thinking again about all the money in higher education. And so the author of Bankers in the Ivory Tower, The Troubling Rise of Financiers in U.S. Higher Education, will be along shortly.
All of that to come. We begin, though, with the U.S. and China. This past week, J.P. Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon called for full and thoughtful engagement with the country as President Biden imposed sweeping tariffs on a range of Chinese imports.
And then, Tim, there's Taiwan. This past week, Reuters reporting U.S. and Taiwan navies conducted joint drills in the Western Pacific in April, citing 4 unidentified people briefed on the matter. And this as China's military has ramped up its activities in and around Taiwan over the past few years. Also, a U.S. delegation in Taiwan this weekend for the inauguration of Taiwan's next president, casting the visit as keeping with longstanding practice in an effort to manage tensions between the self-governing island and China.
China, the U.S., Taiwan, as we like to say, it's complicated. And sometimes a history lesson is key in understanding the situation and what's at stake. Sulman Wasif Khan is professor of history and international relations at Tufts University. His new book, The Struggle for Taiwan, A History of America, China, and the Island Caught Between.
We're now at a point where there are large numbers of ships floating too close to one another, too many planes in the sky. And the U.S. and China seem, to my mind, to be one accident and a bad decision away from something that could go horribly, horribly wrong for all of us. And going through the history shows you both how we got here, but also that there were various ways out along the way. And there are moments that we can look to and learn from, and that might help us better navigate the future.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. And I do wonder, it always feels so delicate, if you will. And I think about going back to when Nancy Pelosi, what was it, the summer of 2022, and took a visit. She was then, U.S. House Speaker, and she went to visit Taipei. That was not a great situation, to say the least.
It was not a great situation. And if you cast your mind back to that, you might remember Hu Xijin, who was the editor of a tabloid, saying her plane should be shot down, which was remarkable. It's not something that you would expect to be said, because usually Beijing has been quite good at controlling the level of vitriol that gets into propaganda. But you think about it, and then you cast your mind back to the Hainan spy plane incident that kicked off George W. Bush's presidency. And you say, a Chinese plane collided with an American plane. But we all managed to walk away from that alive. That was partly because there was an interest in both Beijing and in Washington in getting along and in not going to war. When Pelosi went to Taiwan, the thought that kept going through my mind was, if this goes wrong, do we have that mutual commitment to getting out of it alive still intact? And the answer seemed to be uncertain, which is not something you want to think about when there are two great powers armed with nuclear weapons.
It's interesting. I feel like we have that conversation a lot about, both of us kind of, whether it was the Middle East with Iran and Israel, about walking away and saying, wait a minute, the risks of moving forward or escalating are just, it's too much that's at stake. But when you look at what's happening in Taiwan and the U.S. and China, is that willingness to walk away and preserve some calmness, if you will, is that willingness kind of waning, if you will?
I think it's waxing and waning, to be honest. It depends on any given moment. It was heartening to see some commitment with both Joe Biden and Xi Jinping reaching out to one another and saying, can we walk away from this? It was heartening to an extent to see some recognition that, while China might be a competitor, we don't want to go all the way into cataclysm, and some contact with Chinese officials to that effect. What was not heartening, however, was the fact that the waxing happened too. So you mentioned the tariffs just now. You mentioned the drills, and it's an election year. And in an election year, everybody vies to get tough on China. One of the things Donald Trump did was to forge a bipartisan consensus around the idea that we needed to get tough on China. And that's something that in an election year will lead to what, to my mind, amounts to a lot of posturing. And a lot of dangerous posturing, because the sensitivities in Beijing are such that you don't know when things will go wrong.
Well, as you know, getting tough, the United States getting tough on China, right? Maybe through tariffs. And then there's something different, I feel like, when it comes to Taiwan. Is that fair to say that that is a whole other level in terms of what China, how it sees Taiwan and the importance of it?
I think it's certainly a whole other level to Beijing. I think Taiwan is one of those spots that hurt, and that they felt they had a commitment from the United States to a one China principle, that the United States still says we do not challenge that. But if you look at things like trying to bolster Taiwan's diplomatic partnerships, if you look at things like Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and other senior lawmakers' visits to Taiwan, you really do have to wonder, especially if you're sitting in Beijing, how committed is the United States to that principle that's been, in some ways at the core of the relationship between the two countries since Nixon and Kissinger went to China. If that is being challenged, it opens up a can of worms that's just far more sensitive than even a trade dispute would be.
It feels like with President Xi, the one country, two systems policy that seemed to work, it doesn't feel like it does anymore.
So one country, two systems is a fascinating concept, and Deng Xiaoping was actually the person who came up with it.
Right.
And when Deng comes up with it, it's interesting. He actually wants it to work like two systems. He's very explicit about saying, when Hong Kong comes back under one country, two systems, I don't want to tamper with the second system. It's the goose that lays the golden eggs. Why would I change something that's working? And that actually starts off a huge debate in Taiwan at the time. Maybe one country, two systems is the way to go. What changes under Xi Jinping, of course, is that the second system bit gets left out. Hong Kong, if you look at it today, is not a place that it was even 10 years ago, even 20 years ago, when you could commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre, when you could criticize the government in Beijing, when you can do all sorts of things that, mainland China proper, you probably could not have got away with. That's not the case anymore. So what Xi Jinping has demonstrated is that one country, two systems is a nice concept, but it can change with the people charged with implementing it. And if you're sitting in Taipei and you say, look, we worked really hard to get to a democracy where there have been peaceful transitions of power, one country, two systems doesn't look all that attractive anymore.
Suman, how did we get here where Taiwan is caught between the United States and China? And we know that it's a nation that Beijing covets, protects, ownership. You see it very clearly. And yet, as you note, it wasn't historically Chinese.
Historically, it starts off being its own weird little way station between East Asia and Southeast Asia in maritime terms. And then the Qing dynasty conquers China along with other parts of the world and conquers Taiwan. That dynasty then loses Taiwan to the Japanese Empire in the War of 1894-5, and Taiwan is ceded to Japan in perpetuity. Perpetuity lasts till the end of World War II, and the United States at the Cairo Declaration says that Taiwan is going to be restored to the Republic of China. Problem with that declaration being there's many different Chinas at the time, including, of course, the communists. And the civil war that erupts between the communists and the nationalists, that would be the nationalists would be the Republic of China, is one that the United States is not sure where it stands on. It wants to wash its hands of the nationalists. And when the nationalists are eventually beaten back to the island of Taiwan, the betting money is sooner or later this too is going to become part of the People's Republic of China. What the nationalists set up on Taiwan is a police state, by the way, that has a whiff of settler colonialism to it. So there's not much sympathy for it, but when the Korean War breaks out, Truman sends the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait, and that begins the separation of the island from the government that is governing China. For much of the next few decades, the United States is going to be stuck trying to choose between two Chinas. And it's only when Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon decide to make peace with the PRC in 1971 that the United States once again has a modus vivendi with Beijing. But that leaves the fate of Taiwan uncertain because for domestic reasons, the United States feels it cannot come to a definitive handing over, as it were, of Taiwan to the PRC. But the One China principle acknowledges that Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is but one China, that Taiwan is a part of China, and that the United States does not dispute this formulation. That is more or less the situation that attains still normalization of relations between the United States and the PRC, which Jimmy Carter oversees. Mm-hmm. But that normalization comes with the Taiwan Relations Act, which means that the president is supposed to think about the defense of Taiwan, that being in the interests of the United States, which of course has Beijing howling mad, but that is where we are. And as a result, Taiwan has maintained a separation from China to this day.
Well, it's interesting. So you give that history, and I feel like it's been a tortured relationship a little bit on the part of U.S. and U.S. politicians about what the U.S. role is, right, in terms of protecting Taiwan.
It remains a tortured relationship. So, if you look at the Taiwan Relations Act and ask, how is this consistent with the One China principle?
Right.
Answer, it doesn't look all that consistent, but one can talk one's way into thinking of it that way. If the United States remains committed to the defense of Taiwan, at some level that is saying we have an interest in what is happening here, and we're willing to tell China what to do about it. So to maintain that is somehow consistent with the idea that Taiwan is part of China seems to me to be untenable. Why is the United States committed to this? I think there's a whole host of reasons. There is partly credibility. One wants to show China one can be tough. There is domestic political consideration. One doesn't want to appear weak on China before one's constituents. And what has been created on that island is something that excites some sympathy.
Well, what does Taiwan want? And what's its own kind of independent thought in all of this? And I think about it, especially, we spend so much time, as you would imagine, talking about semiconductors, the importance of TSMC, how important it is to the world, the global world of semiconductors. But I do think about, what does Taiwan want in all of this? What can it do independently, if anything?
So I think what Taiwan wants, and you actually saw consensus on this in the elections earlier this year, there doesn't seem to be any rush to unify with China. The three parties that were contesting the election mainly were all pretty much agreed on that. There is a faction that wants to declare independence outright. What's weighing against that, of course, is if one declares independence outright, one is stuck with a situation where that might provoke China into destroying such independence, de facto independence, as exists at the moment.
Right.
And there's no guarantee that the United States would do the right thing there. One never knows what the United States will do or not do at a given moment. So I think if you asked, what is the one thing most people in Taiwan are agreed on, it would be, we don't want to jeopardize what we have. How one goes about that is a separate thing. Does it come with a commitment to declaring independence? Maybe some point down the line, if one has prepared one's defenses to the point where they could withstand or at least cost China a lot if there were to be an assault. And one of the things that has sharpened this conversation in Taiwan is what happened in Ukraine. It looked like the reason the United States was willing to commit money to Ukraine and support to Ukraine was the fact that the Ukrainians, against quite a bit of the betting money, stood up for themselves. Would Taiwan be willing to do that? And one of the interesting things about studying the past and studying how wars break out in the past and what people do is you never know till the last moment. There's an element of choice that comes into it. But it is a conversation that's being had over there, and it's a conversation that's being had with increasing intensity.
Just 30 seconds, and I need you to be quick if I may. The driver's seat. Who's in the driver's seat in this triangular relationship? U.S., China, or Taiwan?
Nobody. everybody has the illusion they're in the driver's seat, but they're all jostling for the steering wheel.
That can cause issues, as we know. I hope we can continue this conversation in the future, because I do feel like this is an important issue. And you're absolutely right with what's going on in Russia, Ukraine right now. Very, very topical and very, very relevant. Congratulations on the book. Suman Khan, professor and Dennison Chair in History and International Relations at Tufts University. His new book that is out, The Struggle for Taiwan, A History of America, China, and the Island Caught Between.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Russia's President Vladimir Putin in Beijing this past week, meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, publicly underlining their strong relations in a direct challenge to the United States as Moscow presses forward with a new offensive in Ukraine. Putin's visit coming as Russia has become more economically dependent on China following Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine more than 2 years ago.
A new book out takes us back to how Russia might have been more of an ally to the West and to the U.S. It's in a novel by Kevin Maney. He's the New York Times bestselling author who was a journalist in Moscow. His work is one of fiction. It's called Red Bottom Line, and it was written 30 years ago.
I actually was writing it when my daughter was first born. And so 30-some years later, she starts asking me about it. She says, you wrote that novel. Where is it? I'm going, like, I wrote it on a floppy disk on WordPerfect. Like, I'm never going to. And it turned out that I had a printout of it. And I pulled out the printout and I started reading it. And I'm going, like, wait, this is actually pretty good with a little work.
Why did it just collect dust on a floppy disk for 30 years, though? Like, what stopped you from pursuing it?
I didn't know anything about the book business. I sent it to a couple of editors just randomly, which was probably dumb. Didn't hear anything back, and I just kind of figured, well, all right, never mind. It's like probably not that good. But then I went on and started writing nonfiction books and had a lot of success. I have published 9 nonfiction books, all about business and biographies and things like that. So when I returned to it, I had more of a path and more of a knowledge of like how to get this thing published.
I think what's interesting is it takes us back to a different era, right? And I know at your book party we talked a little bit about it and stuff, but you think about, what our expectations were for a Russia moving forward, or Soviet, or what the new Soviet Union, or the dissolution, like they did their first presidential election. Like you just think about where it was and where it could have gone.
Well, that was, and when you read if you read the novel, because it's all real stuff that I experienced. I mean, it's basically a made-up story based on real facts of like, what was happening. And there was this optimism. There was a sense among like young people, and there's these young characters in the novel who are all into this idea of like creating businesses and getting into private enterprise and making contacts with Westerners and there was this incredible optimism that that something new was going to arise out of this. And
everybody felt that, right?
Yeah, everybody felt that. And U.S. business people were starting to go over. I ended up being present at the opening of the Moscow McDonald's.
I was going to talk about that because that's like so iconic from that era. And it was also iconic 2 years ago around this time. We talked a lot about it because when McDonald's exited the country in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it brought back those images from the early 90s of people waiting in line to try the first Big Mac.
That's right, yeah. And we forget about it now, but it was this incredible cultural, geopolitical event that a McDonald's opened in Moscow. And there were I think there were 38,000 people that went the first day to that McDonald's because they were so hungry not hungry for burgers, but hungry for American stuff.
Well, it's funny. I have a conversation sometimes with my husband and we just say, what if we had decided rather than, especially if you look at the tensions between US and China today, like if we decided, well, let's work with Russia and let's manufacture stuff there. Like just if we had made as a world, generally decided to work more with Russia going forward. Like you just wonder how things might have played out differently.
Well, there wasn't the transition time. There wasn't enough time for enough stuff to happen, because pretty quickly, and I experienced this because I wasn't living there, but I was traveling there frequently.
Right.
And from the late 80s to around 1992, you could actually sense every trip that things were getting like more chaotic, more dangerous, more weird. Because there's this sort of transitions of the government from Gorbachev to Yeltsin. Yeltsin was kind of a disaster. He started handing out whole industries to his friends, which is what the birth of the oligarchs was. Sort of mob activity was running half the economy. And so there was never a chance for this to really catch hold before the Russian society basically got sick of this and was welcoming somebody like Putin to come in and say, I'm going to actually create some order out of this chaos. And then it just all kind of fell apart in terms of being able to connect with the West.
What I think is so notable about the novel is that it paints a picture of what could have been in Russia and what many people in the early 1990s thought would actually happen. It's there collecting dust for 30 years before you go and publish it. And here you are publishing it, and it's the complete opposite of what ended up happening, as you just described.
Right.
So what was the moment you think it went wrong?
It was under the Yeltsin administration, right? And, look, I never met Boris Yeltsin, but there's lots of reports about him. I mean, the guy was kind of a disaster as a leader, and it just let things sort of fall apart all around him. So what could have been set on a path of creating a more global Western-facing country just got derailed, and then and Putin wanted to take it in a completely different direction once he got aboard. One of the points you're sort of alluding to here is that, if I had sat down to write this novel today, trying to rely on my memory or my notes or something I could never have captured all the details that I did. Even for me rereading it, one of the magical things about it is that I wrote it in the moment. So I was recalling all these sort of very fresh, tiny little details about what life was like for individual Russians or for somebody who was trying to run a factory and trying to transition to capitalism and all these things. And because I was writing it while I was there, those are captured, and then all these years later, now I was just able to put a little bit more shine on them and make it a more holistic story that worked better.
What was that like when you picked it up again, right? Because you hadn't read it really in 30 years.
In 30 years.
And to go back there and be like, oh my God, this is exactly what was going on.
Well, what was fun for me was because I remembered very little of it. So it was almost like I was reading it for the first time, and I'm going, who is this guy that wrote this? It's
this thing is actually pretty good. It should be published.
No, but it's fascinating, right? It's like a window back into kind of exactly what you were experiencing.
Yeah. So I wrote this little author's note in the beginning that before I thought of doing anything with it, I actually sent it to my daughter, and she's a journalist and editor herself, so she reads it. And she writes back to me and says, Dad, this is really good, but here I've got 2 pages of notes that you can make it better. But one of the things I thought was funny that she pointed out was sort of especially the main character, there's kind of this 90s sort of, the characters from Friends kind of language and snarkiness that are in the book that she said is sort of inappropriate today, right? And so if I were writing that book today, it wouldn't even have that sort of language in it.
But it's emblematic of the time.
But it was emblematic of the time, right?
Yeah, a time without iPhones and a time where people had to actually, make plans to meet in certain places.
Right, and make jokes about things that nobody would want to make jokes about it anymore and stuff like that, right?
Give us some thoughts as you've been a journalist, just thinking about kind of what's going on in the world and how democracy continues to be tested. Because we think every time a market seems to open up its arms to it, we think, okay, it's just going to continue, and it's not the case. It wasn't certainly in the Soviet Union. It hasn't really been in China, even though a lot of Western companies moved in there, and we thought it would be a different outcome.
I think there's an interesting nuance to that. There was not so much about this anticipation that Russia or China, when in this 90s, and we're going to be democratic. But there was this anticipation that there was going to be a legal system, a rule of law, a set of rules that everybody could play by that was not the whims of a dictator or something like that. That's what's really important to businesses, more than the fact that the people are going to vote for their leaders. The fact that the opposite of what's happening now in Russia or in China, where Xi is sort of taking all these sort of random actions of penalizing tech companies and other, and there's an uncertainty, and that uncertainty is what the business people don't want. Less than the idea of pure democracy. Right.
The rules change. It's funny that you say that. Where Zeekr, having Chinese EV maker making its debut here in New York, an IPO. It was a big deal here. But part of the questioning with the executive about Chinese government involvement, and that's part of the problem right now, right? We just don't know as investors, and we've seen certainly investors pull back when it comes to China overall of just not knowing, do the rules change, especially if you're investing in a business.
Yeah, and there was this, in the moment when the book is set, there was this rush into Russia by a lot of businesses, McDonald's and Procter & Gamble. There was one of the impetuses for me going over in the first place, in fact, was there was the Russian people had never seen much of anything of American products, and I learned about a convention that was going to happen where all these companies like Procter & Gamble and Unilever or whatever were just going to show stuff like toothpaste and deodorant, and an enormous convention center where there was all these typical displays of all these little things, and just mobs of Russian citizens coming in and just with bags and trying to grab everything that they could. But all those companies wanted to go in because they were anticipating that the economy was going to open up. There was going to be this hunger for Western-made products, but also that there was going to emerge out of this, the Gorbachev era, something that was more predictable and stable than under the whims of the former Soviet premiers that could just basically order anything to have happen, right?
You say you're not a political expert, you're more an expert in business, but I'm still going to ask you some questions about the politics because
you understand the
you absolutely understand
of it all.
We had on the program a couple of weeks ago David E. Sanger from the New York Times. He's got a new book out called New Cold Wars: China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. And he argues that the West didn't see coming post the collapse of the Soviet Union what we see today. We were busy fighting, this war on terror, and in the meantime, China has the Belt and Road Initiative around the world, and Russia is coming back with its plans for an empire once again. And I'm wondering if you see any similarities now in 2024, what we saw before the fall of the Soviet Union. Like if there is sort of a new kind of axes forming right now between Russia and China.
Well, I mean, it seems to me like the opposite of what was happening back then, right? I mean, there was this moment in time. It's so different now that we almost can't believe that it actually was happening. But if you grew up in the 1980s, there was this thing called the Iron Curtain.
Yeah.
Which was impenetrable, right? It was all those Eastern European countries. It was the Soviet Union. China was a closed nation, essentially, to the West. So there was this entire part of the world that wasn't even part of the global economy.
But is that happening again?
So, well, that seems to be where we're returning to.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
So there was this moment in time that was mostly contained in the 1990s, really, between China and Russia, in the Deng Xiaoping era in China, when it seemed like all of that, this was the era when the idea of globalization was birthed, because there was this moment in time when it seemed like the whole world was going to play together. And if the whole world was going to play together, then there was this prospect for a kind of global peace that was never possible before. And in the late 1990s, that was sort of where we were. Mm-hmm. And the economies around the world were absolutely booming. And that was the whole .com boom in the U.S.
Right.
And the markets were going crazy. And to me, what marked the end of that was 9/11. Suddenly, it just was like this wake-up call that the world was not going to play together. And then we started to see things roll back in Russia and China through the 2010s. And we've kind of moved back to that era when there was this entire part of the world that was operating separately from the rest of us.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. I do feel like, some of the alliances, we've talked a lot about kind of the Middle East, and I'm lumping a lot in there, but just kind of the amount of money that's coming out of the Middle East and going into so many different areas, whether it's business, whether it's renewables, whether it's sports, and just that how countries, United States and others, are picking when to look away because of the money involved or the need for an alliance versus when to say, wait a minute, something's not here. It's just it's an interesting time, to say the least.
Yeah. And and there's another sort of sad thing about this too, is that
I just got about 40 seconds left.
Okay, I'm
not rushing you.
Because I've always written about technology.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I sought out in Moscow in the late 80s and early 90s were these little startups that were starting to bloom. Mm. And there were so many smart, incredibly talented software people in Russia at the time. And there was this seed of what could have been a global tech industry that came out of there that just got snuffed. And either the smart people that had those ambitions came to the U.S. And set up in Silicon Valley, which a lot of them did,
right?
Or they just sort of disappeared, and that never materialized.
Right, like what could have been, right? Very different. Thank you so much. This was what I was hoping we could do with you. So thank you so much for finding time. Really appreciate it.
Awesome.
Kevin Maney, we said New York Times best-selling journalist and author. His book, Red Bottom Line.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
The college graduation season is underway. Columbia University canceling its main commencement ceremony here in New York City, others pulling back as well, following the recent pro-Palestinian protests on campuses around the country that led to police arrests and a clampdown on protest activities.
As part of the protest, students called for universities to pull back on investments linked to Israel, which once again brought to light the many rich endowments and their specific investments and their ties to various forms of Wall Street.
Right. And those ties made us want to explore more. So we sat down with Charlie Eaton, Associate Professor of Sociology at University of California, Merced. He is the author of Bankers in the Ivory Tower, The Troubling Rise of Financiers in U.S. Higher Education.
Our wealthiest universities now have endowments that are valued in the tens of billions of dollars. And that connects them to every corner of the global economy. A lot of that is via hedge fund and private equity investments. The wealthiest endowments now invest more than 60% or sometimes even more than 70% of their endowments with private equity and hedge funds.
I wonder how that's different now than versus the 1980s, because something that we've been talking a lot about, Professor, over the last few weeks has been what happened on Columbia's campus, for example, during the 1980s when the students were protesting apartheid in South Africa. How has the relationship between money and education changed between then and now?
If you go back to the 80s, very few of the endowments, even the wealthiest endowments, were investing with private equity and hedge funds. It starts in the 80s, but over the last 40 years, those endowments have grown through those kinds of endowments by an average of 10% average annual rate of return over the years. So that what the portfolio is invested in has really changed.
What's most problematic about the relationship today? Is it just that it's heightened? Is it the amount of money involved, the financial entanglement? Over $50 billion at Harvard, 40 at Yale, 34 at Princeton, 34 billion, 13 billion, almost 14 billion at Columbia, 21 at the University of Pennsylvania. Real money. These are big money. And, when we inquire about them, many say, well, this is what's required at an institution of this caliber and this size, if you will, to attract professors in the facilities. But I do wonder, these are big numbers. And I just wonder how, the amount of money that's involved, this financial entanglement, what's most problematic about it in your view and from the research and analysis that you've done? Yeah, there's two sides of it. I mean, one is, are the things that endowments invest in, are they consistent with the values of the university? So, questions like fossil fuel divestment have gotten at those kind of questions. But the other side of it is, what do the universities use the funds for? And if you look at the largest university endowments, they've gone up tenfold since the 1970s. Princeton's a good example because there's no law school, no business school there to complicate it. Their endowment's up tenfold, but they still enroll a similar number of undergraduate students to what they enrolled in the 70s. And what that means is, you go back to the 70s, they spent about $10,000 per year per student from the endowment to support university activities. Today, they spend about $100,000 per year per student from the endowment to support university activities. The question I ask is, would Princeton still be a world-class university if it enrolled twice as many students to serve more Americans from more walks of life and only spent $50,000 per year per student? So there's two sides of the question of how should endowments be managed and what should the funds be used for?
I wonder about the demands that protesters are making today. there are lots of different protests happening or were happening on campuses around the country, but in some cases, like at Columbia, for example, calling for the school to divest from companies that support the government of Israel or do business there, for example. I'm curious if that type of action would even be possible for an endowment given the complexity of endowments today.
Well, Brown University and Northwestern University have recently suggested they can. The example of fossil fuel divestment has suggested that you can do some pretty complex divestment. I mean, I think we like to think of universities as innovative places, and we like to think of finance as an innovative sector that's a can-do sector where we can use technology and use innovation to be thoughtful about what we invest in. So, at a certain level, I think there is a kind of can-do thing. If you get a little bit more brass tacks, one thing is that particularly smaller endowments invest more of their portfolio with index funds and other passive funds. And there's a growing community of passive fund managers that use ESG, environmental, social, and governance principles for managing investments, and they use screens. There's over 300 such fund managers who screen out weapons manufacturers, for example.
Right.
So you do have private sector finance partners who you can work with to do this. And I think that's why some universities have expressed some openness to looking at what can be done and what should be done. I think the harder question is, what are your values, and how should you apply your values to your investing? It's not the technical question of how to do it.
Well, and I do wonder, going back to those endowment sizes and the importance that these schools hold in terms of having relationships with big donors, major donors, and making sure that they can maintain that endowment. But what does it do to kind of who has the power in an academic economy?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And another issue that your question gets at is the issue of transparency. Endowments have a culture and an institutional history of operating in the dark. They're managed by a chief investment officer with oversight from a board of trustees, and they often work with private equity or hedge fund managers who themselves value secrecy because that's part of the business. You're trying to beat the market. You're trying to use private information and your own smarts to outsmart the market, and you don't want others to know what your strategy is. So I think opening up your endowments to invest according to other principles, being more inclusive to students and community members who want to have a say in the endowment being managed according to their values, requires a shift in transparency in some of these practices that aren't how endowment managers have been built historically.
Should the endowments be taxed based on your view, your research?
It depends on whether the endowment is being used sufficiently to serve enough students and students from all backgrounds. So, if a university uses its endowment to grow its enrollment, to serve all communities, then it should be tax exempt. If not, then I think there's reason to tax the endowment so that we can support students to go where there's not as much resources.
Is it tough to make sure that the right values are in place, especially when the board members are overwhelmingly, as you write about, drawn from the alumni who tend to donate most generously?
Yeah, I think it is tough, but universities are supposed to be places of innovation and ideas. And so I think reimagining the university and reimagining finance to be more inclusive and to give a say to our students and our community members is something that we're up to.
Professor, appreciate you taking the time. That's Charlie Eden, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Merced. He joins us from Merced today. He's the author of Bankers in the Ivory Tower, The Troubling Rise of Financiers in U.S. Higher Education.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. Or watch us live on YouTube.
I walk this empty street on the boulevard of broken dreams.
All right, folks. Sit sit down, grab something to drink, because this is a story of broken dreams. It's also a story that's among our most read on the Bloomberg today. It's a story about IM Academy, also known as the Harvard of Trading, that grew from a small New York operation into a global phenomenon during the pandemic by selling the promise that it could teach anyone, particularly teens and 20-somethings, how to become a savvy retail investors for a fee, of course. It promised a lot, and many lost a lot. We wanted to know more about this story. So with us is Bloomberg News personal finance reporter Alice Cantor. She's joining us from London, where we know it's a little bit later. So Alice, we so appreciate you hanging around to talk with us. This story, by the way, to be featured in the forthcoming issue of Bloomberg Businessweek magazine. You can read it now on the Bloomberg and also find it at bloomberg.com/businessweek. First of all, a story like this, Alice, how did you first come across it?
Hi, Carol. Well,
hello.
First, thanks for having me on. It was in the midst of the pandemic, actually, and I was looking at stories around financial crimes in France, because at the time I was in Paris. And I saw this small news website that did an investigation about IM Academy in France. And it was about all these teenagers who were getting really excited in the pandemic about making money from meme stocks and Bitcoin. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Mm-hmm. And they had come across IM Academy, this company that promised them that within a few months, they could really become multimillionaires. They could earn a passive income if they just knew the right strategy to trade online. This company had the recipe for them. So yeah, I started digging into it and found out that France was just one of the many, many countries that this New York-based company had expanded in and was making a lot of victims, essentially.
Well, and I want to get into the size and scope in terms of how many got impacted, but tell me how it works. I mean, I've kind of read through here, so I have an idea, but tell our world how this company worked, how it said, okay, you're going to make money, and what was involved in terms of becoming a member and what you had to kind of give across, because you had to pay a fee, right, to be a part of this.
Yeah, so initially it worked like any subscription to an online product. It's like an online educational platform. So you paid $250 to join, and then you'd have to pay $250 every month to keep having access to this online platform. And on the platform, you'd get sort of pre-recorded videos of so-called IM educators that would teach you the basics of markets. How do you make a stop loss? How do you figure out a difference in percentage points, and how do you take advantage of that? And then they also said, well, they have this amazing algorithm that charts prices of currencies and stocks and any financial product. And this algorithm can sort of tell you when a price is going to go up or going to go down. And so if you just pay the subscription, you'll have access to all that information, and you can really quite quickly earn money by using that trading advice and learning how to read those graphs.
I feel like a lot of folks in the financial community would be like, wait a minute, what is this algorithm? And it almost sounds too good to be true. Tell us about that. They targeted really a younger generation. How did they do that? I mean, it sounds like, I was looking through it, it almost sounds like there were influencers on there about look at all the money you can make here.
Absolutely. So at the end of the day, the software that they promoted, the algorithm, doesn't work. It's very basic. Mm-hmm. It's not really predictive. But they really lured people in through the lifestyle that you could have once you get those millions. And they did that on social media. And essentially, the CEO of the company hired these really muscular, energetic salesmen that went on Instagram and showed their lives on a Dubai yacht or at a 5-star villa in Italy, saying, "Look, I'm this rich. You want to be like me? Well, why don't you just join IM? And this is the recipe for success, essentially." So that's really how they attracted people that way.
Who's behind it all? Tell us a little bit about the company's CEO and how he did in all of this.
Yeah, so Chris Terry is a man who was born in the Bronx, and he started working construction. He had the construction company had ties to a mob family, and he had to pay a fine. He was implicated in a criminal conspiracy, so that's where he started, and he likes to mention his mob background quite often. But then he went on to Amway and was a salesman for another multi-level marketing company. And then after that, he tried to build a reputation of himself as a trader, saying he was managing hedge funds and he knew all about financial markets. But really, he was never a financial broker. He has no financial real accreditation from any real U.S. institution. And he's made very well for himself. So he's definitely a multimillionaire. IM at its height in the pandemic was selling the equivalent of $500 to $600 million in subscriptions for the year. And he flies around in his private jet and has a bunch of condos around the world, in Dubai, in Las Vegas, in New York. So he's making a lot of money from all this.
Tell us about, so he made a lot of money, but tell us about some of the individuals who paid, who got a part of the platform, did some of the trading, some of these young individuals, some really sad stories in terms of what happened to them. They lost a lot.
Yeah, so people would come in thinking, I'm going to learn all about retail trading, make a lot of money. And what happens is not only do they pay the subscription, but often they start trading and kind of gambling their money away using strategies that don't work. So pretty quickly, they'll have a lot of losses. But what IM educators will tell them then is, well, there's this other side of the business. You can earn a commission if you sell subscriptions to other members. And so that's the multi-level marketing aspect of it. And so where it gets a bit tricky and where people feel like they can't leave the company and they end up losing way more than just like a regular, financial service is that these teenagers end up really kind of being gaslit and a little bit sort of brainwashed into believing that, it's their life's purpose to be in this company. They have to keep trying to recruit. They have to keep bringing in more people. If they're failing, it's their fault. So there's this whole strategy to keep people involved, to keep people selling more subscriptions to others, even when they realize the trading lessons are really basic and not helpful at all.
It does sound like, and I know you get into this, it's prime for regulators, it feels like, to take a look. Alice, where are we on that front? Because it sounds like this, has to be on their radar.
Absolutely. So, across Europe, a bunch of investigations are open at the moment, but nothing has really happened so far. And then the biggest investigation that's ongoing right now is by the FTC in the US that is looking at IM Academy. They're reviewing complaints. They're talking to the CEO, and well, it looks like there might be in discussions to kind of try to put an end to this company's activities. But to be honest with you, Carol, there's not that many regulations around multi-level marketing companies or these kinds of financial education platforms. So they might just go on. They might just filter through all these regulations and come kind of. They might pay a fine and just get on with their business. Yeah,
I do wonder on something like this. Is it kind of eyes wide open if you're going to pay money, like you have to kind of know what you're getting into? Or is it a case of, is there a way of proving, and I'm not saying there is, but, fraud of some sort in promising an algorithm that's going to kind of do everything? Or do we all just kind of know that maybe if it sounds too good to be true, it's not going to be true?
Well, yes, they can be liable for making false income claims. Mm-hmm. So early on, they would have people on Instagram posting pictures of their Rolexes and bills and saying, I make 10 grand a month in passive earning and passive income. So those kinds of figures can really put the company in difficulty because you're not allowed to make these claims unless you can back them up. And in this case, they can't. Yeah. So that's one area that's problematic. The other one is that they say they don't give financial advice, but really they kind of do, and they almost trade for the people that are part of the company. It's kind of tricky, but they usually just tell them which brokers to go with. They used to mirror trades automatically, so just copy and paste trades from traders and give it to Alice, the members.
I have to ask you, I only got about 30 seconds, so just quickly, company is still active?
Yes, it is still active. I was just at a conference there in Budapest that they had a huge company rally a few months ago. So they're still active and doing well.
I got to say, you paint such incredible pictures in this story. I feel like it's like a mini documentary just waiting to happen. But it sounds like the story's still to be played out here. So we'll continue to follow any updates. So glad we could get some time with you to kind of spell it out for us. As we said, it's among the most read stories on the Bloomberg today. Alice Cantor, she's Bloomberg News personal finance reporter, joining us from London.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plenty ahead in our second hour of the weekend edition of Bloomberg Businessweek, including the new Apple Plus miniseries about the Black Panther being smuggled to Cuba under the guise of a fake Hollywood production. Yeah, sounds like Argo, but it's not. We talk with the executive producer of the Big Cigar.
Plus, the best art exhibitions in Venice, why the cassette tape revival is upon us. Yeah, I mean, my little brother uses cassette tapes.
Don't you remember dating? It's like, here, I have
because he's cool, I guess.
I just remember dating. Guys were like, here, I have a cassette tape for you.
Yeah, but that's because that's what because there was no Spotify then, Carol.
Who had a Walkman?
Yeah.
I had both Walkmans, cassette and CD.
Mixtapes.
All right, so we've got Bloomberg Pursuits coming up. First up this hour, you may have heard the world's biggest sporting tournament is coming to North America in 2026. Soccer's FIFA World Cup will be played in the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
Overseeing the matches in Miami is the former CEO of Celebrity Cruises, Lisa Lutoff-Perlo, who went from selling cruises door to door to becoming CEO of the company. She wrote about all that in her book, Making Waves, A Woman's Rise to the Top Using Smarts, Heart, and Courage, all of which she will likely use in her new job as CEO of World Cup Miami. Being asked to do the job initially, though, came as a bit of a surprise.
One day, just out of the blue, I got a text from a woman that I know. I met under different circumstances, and she texted me and said, "Got a minute?" And had no idea why she was asking that. And I said, "For you, of course." She called me and talked to me about this, and I wasn't sure that I really wanted to jump in and
what was the trepidation?
I was just stepping away after a crazy career and working really hard and being so busy. And I knew I wanted to do some things. I just wasn't sure I wanted to take on something so big and something I really didn't know anything about, men's soccer and the World Cup. But the more I talked to people, the more excited I got. And just like everything else I've done in my life and career, I said, what the heck? I'm a lifelong learner. I'll figure it out. And here I am.
I was going to say, it kind of sounds like your path to becoming CEO at Celebrity, which was, taking advantage of the opportunities that I don't want to say were given to you, but that you had earned. There was a reason people were asking you to do these things, going from, essentially a salesperson all the way up to CEO.
Sure. And there was a reason that she reached out to me, and because she was in a meeting. Here's how the story went. She was in a meeting, and she's representing a big stakeholder in the Miami World Cup. And they were describing the attributes of the ideal CEO that they wanted to run it. And she said every time they mentioned an attribute, which one of them was actually being a CEO, she said my name kept popping into her head, and she just had to reach out to me to do this. And as I've learned, as I've gone through this, I realized that understanding and knowing soccer isn't what they were looking for. They were looking for someone who ran a serious business, because this is a serious business. Someone who could bring communities together. And there's no more bringing of communities better than the cruise industry. Collaborating, because we have to collaborate across many different cities and counties to pull this off. And running extraordinary events, and guest experiences, which I did, and also really challenging logistical issues that you have to deal with. And, we're going to have 600,000 to 1 million visitors in South Florida during those 5 weeks. So those were all the reasons that I think I was on their list and why they chose me.
Well, wait, so how quickly did you say yes? After some trepidation, how quickly did you say, yeah, I'm on it?
It took me a little while. First of all, it was a long process. As you probably know, as these things go. The more people I talked to, though, the more excited I got about it. Listen, this is historic. This has never been done before. It's the biggest World Cup in the history of the World Cup. There are 48 teams, 104 matches, 3 different countries. This is big. The world stops when the World Cup happens. I thought about all the people I was going to meet and all the opportunities that I was going to be a part of that are historic and that have never happened to me before. And it's a 2-year gig. So I'm like, all right, you can do this. You can sign up for this. And it has a beginning, it has an end. So I'm in.
You're so real. And I got to ask you, did you binge on Ted Lasso? Did you do a lot of Googling online since this wasn't necessarily something you were so familiar with? What did you do to kind of be like, yeah, this is kind of cool?
Well, first of all, Carol, I have binged on Ted Lasso probably 3 times for all 3 seasons, right?
Fair.
The greatest show ever. And so, sure. And listen, I'm in Miami. We've got Messi. We've got Beckham. This is the soccer capital, the football capital of the United States. It's the gateway to Latin America. Miami is a sexy, wonderful city. Everyone wants to be here. So there were so many great things about it. It's not going to be easy, but nothing in my career has been. But I just thought about how cool and exciting this was going to be.
Yeah.
And my husband is a huge soccer fan, loves soccer, loves the World Cup. And I worked with 20,000 crew members from all over the world who all played football. That was their sport, and that's what they loved. So I do have an affection for the sport, even though I don't know a lot about it.
Well, and my understanding, you really kind of lay it out really well why it does make sense for you to be doing this. My understanding is that this is going to bring in more visitors than the Super Bowl. So it's a lot, right? This is just massive. We all know it. I just remember when it's going on, like it doesn't matter what company you're at, there's like viewing rooms because everybody is watching it. So tell us a little bit about like how you're thinking about how do you put your own spin on it, your own mark on it?
Well, we're in the planning stages of that right now. So, I have 2 ambitions as the CEO of the FIFA 2026 Miami World Cup. One is to be the envy of every other city in North America that's hosting these matches. And the other is to ensure that it performs financially because, I want a surplus. I don't care if it's $1. Mm-hmm. And so we're in the planning process right now. Over the next 90 days, we're going to put our plan together about what we need to raise and how we need to offset the costs. And I really want to think about what's going to attract companies to sponsor this. I will tell you, every time that I am talking to someone and they say, so what are you doing? And I mention what I'm doing, their eyes light up. Everybody wants to be a part of this. It's families, it's companies, it's employees, it's communities, it's everybody. Soccer is just, 19 billion viewers. Now, it's over a period of 5 weeks, but there are 19 billion people watching all of these matches all over the world when the World Cup happens. 1.5 billion watch the Super Bowl. So this, in order of magnitude, is ginormous.
Well, and I'm just thinking about Tim and I are lucky enough that we've covered the U.S. Open here in New York City, and it's yes, it's about the matches and the players, no doubt about it, but it is such a hospitality experience in terms of the food and the venues. And we've got about 40 seconds, then we'll come back and talk more. But are you thinking a lot about that? You understand hospitality.
Yeah, that was one of the big reasons they liked me for the role. And I do understand hospitality. And absolutely, we are looking at every venue in Miami-Dade County. We're looking at outside of the county because we're going to have to spread out with all those people, as you can imagine. But yeah, we're going to figure out some fantastic events and hospitality for everyone, for sure.
Do you think we should go down there, Carol, for the match?
Lisa, I think you need to make that part of
should we do a little broadcast?
Bring us down and we'll do a live broadcast along with everybody else who's going to be there.
Well, you 2 are my favorites. Aww. So I'll figure if we can figure that out for sure.
Score. It's official.
Your home of New Jersey will be pulling you that way too for matches.
Hey, listen, New York, New Jersey has the final.
That's exactly.
True. Lisa, one thing I wanted to ask you, and I was looking through in prep for this, there was an Instagram post, and it reminded us that you are the first former CEO from outside the world of sports to lead a FIFA World Cup 26 host committee. Do you feel pressure as a result of that?
No different than I felt my entire career, Carol.
Fair.
It's when the announcement was made, the local announcement in the I think it was the Miami Herald. Yeah, it was the Miami Herald. My husband took the page and he put it on my desk, and I took a photo of it and I posted on social media that day. And I have had so many opportunities to be covered by the press, whether it's business press like yours, lifestyle press, travel press, consumer press, magazines, newspapers, but I have never until now been headlined in the sports section. And I just thought that was hilarious that I've actually made the sports section. And yeah, you always feel a little bit of pressure because you're doing something new and you're in uncharted waters, if you will. Pardon that bad cruise pun, but I'm also invigorated and excited by it as well.
Is there anybody you want to talk to, or you have been talking to, though, leading up to this, when you think about sport events or just experiential, things for consumers overall?
Well, one of the great things about this, just like other things that I've done in my career, is I'm surrounded by a lot of different types of experience in that regard. So I'm working with a group of people that has Super Bowl experience. I'm working with some people that have CONCACAF experience, some people that have experience working with FIFA, because that's also very new for all of us. And the subtitle of my book is A Woman's Rise to the Top Using Smarts, Heart, and Courage. And I think part of being smart is surrounding yourself with people who have different and more experience than you do in certain ways. So they add a tremendous amount of value. And I hope that I, in turn, add a tremendous amount of value as well. So it's a good team. We all bring some good experience that we all need. So I think it's going to work out well. At least that's the intention, for sure.
Are you still building the team at this point?
Yes, I am. We are small and mighty right now, and over time, the event is in a couple of years, but right now, between now and the 1st of June, I'd really like to get the core leadership team together. So there's a couple of pieces of that puzzle still left to go, and then we'll put our planning together, and then we'll start adding the rest of the team in early fall.
Are you leaving me, Tim? Are you pitching yourself?
I mean, in the winter, maybe. Yeah, I could go down there in the winter.
Send me a note. Yeah, private message me, Tim.
Sounds good. Hey, so is your boss FIFA essentially?
No. Well, listen, all of our host city boss is FIFA. And, there are a lot of restrictions. There are a lot of things that we have to follow. There are a lot of FIFA rules. This is a FIFA event in the city of Miami, New York, New Jersey, Kansas City, Seattle, all of the different cities. And we work very closely with FIFA, and they're getting to know the United States a little more, and we're getting to know them a little more. The way we work here is quite different, and our experience here is quite different than a lot of these other countries that they work with. And so we're all finding our way together to put on an extraordinary event in 2026.
Yeah, so cool. No doubt about it. Hey, one thing I was thinking, and I think about this when I'm going somewhere, whether it was a Disney theme park, whether it was the US Open, or just a concert, like this combination, this balance of willing to have a great experience, but you don't want to feel like you're constantly being faced with marketing and sponsors and everything screaming money. So I'm curious how you think about that balance. Is how important that is to you, or how you think about applying it?
Well, listen, every experience is going to have a branding component. That's just the way it is, because these people are paying the bill. But it doesn't have to be obnoxious. It doesn't have to be in your face. And if you're providing a great experience and a brand is associated with that, then you only would hope that people would have a really strong and good and positive feeling about that brand. So that's always something that's a delicate balance. I always feel like if people are having a lot of fun, then and they are enjoying the experience, just like I said in the cruise industry, then they're going to want to spend money, and they're not going to be opposed to the fact that there's a company that's associated with the experience that they're having. So we'll make sure that experience above all else, but that brands get the recognition they deserve for the investment that they're going to make.
All right, got to ask you, any fun players you've been able to talk to kind of pick their brain about stuff?
Not yet, but I can't wait to meet Lionel Messi.
Very, very cool.
And David Beckham, two great players right here in my backyard.
I have to say, at Milken, which was out on the West Coast last week, where we were doing our live broadcast, there was a line constantly for the main ballroom, which was actually kind of far away. And one of the big lines was for David Beckham, who was there making a presentation. So it was really, really cool.
He was at Milken, too?
He was at Milken. It's that cross-section of so much. Ted Lasso, their important word was believe. Do you have kind of a word that you keep in your head?
Ooh, what's going over your door to your office?
Exactly.
Okay, well, funny enough, Carol and Tim, over the door in my home office is the Ted Lasso belief sign.
No.
Yes.
I love
yes.
that.
Yes. And it's because I believe that I can do this, and I believe it's going to be fantastic. And, you know, there's a saying, whether you think you can or can't, you're right. And I believe I can.
Well, listen, we wish you good luck and looking forward to hearing the plans as they roll out, and just looking forward to what you are going to be doing for the next couple of years. I wanted to ask you then what's next, but I feel like I'm going to give you a break and not go there, at least not yet, because you got a lot ahead of you. We believe in you, and really fun to have you back with us. So good luck with everything, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Tim. Always great being with you. Ciao.
All right. Take care. Lisa Lutoff-Perlo, of course, as we said, former CEO of Celebrity Cruises, now the CEO of World Cup Miami, just taking that over. And of course, check out her book, fun read, Making Waves, A Woman's Rise to the Top Using Smarts, Heart, and Courage. And really, I feel like a determination that, listen, I can do this. Just go.
Believe.
Believe.
That's
Love
all
that.
you need.
Isn't that great?
That is. I love it.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. Or watch us live on YouTube.
It's 1974. A leading black revolutionary is at a party, also under a nationwide manhunt by the FBI. He meets a powerful Hollywood producer. They decide to create a fake movie production, not with the goal to create films. Nope. It's to hatch his escape plan to Cuba.
It's all in a new miniseries that debuted Friday on Apple TV+. It's called The Big Cigar and follows the true story of one of the founders of the Black Panther Party, Huey P. Newton. Behind the series, executive producer Jim Hecht, also known for Winning Time, The Rise of the Lakers Dynasty, and for working on the Ice Age movies.
Yeah, he's done a lot. Hecht joined me and Bloomberg News equities reporter Bailey Lipschultz and began by sharing how he brought his graduate thesis to streaming 25 years later.
This is what I always wanted to do. And so when Josh Behrman, who is a friend of mine, stole the story that ultimately became Argo to Smokehouse, to George Clooney's company, I was like, I have something similar. I think it's better, cooler, better characters. And he sort of took a look at what I had and agreed. And so that was 2009, maybe. And then he started working on the article, and we couldn't find Bert Schneider. Like, he had produced all these movies, Easy Riders, Last Picture Show, 5 Easy Pieces, The Monkees, and he had just sort of disappeared. His house had burned down. No one knew where to find him, so we were about to give up. And then I used to write at night a lot, so I went to Swingers one night at like 3 o'clock in the morning, and they were kicking out this older, unhoused gentleman with a walker, and he dropped money on the floor. And when I bent down to help him pick it up, I saw the eyes, and I was like, "Oh my God, you're Bert Schneider." And he was like, "Yes, tell them who I am. Tell them what I did with Chaplin." And we sat in a booth. He was living in a one-room motel next to Swingers Diner on Beverly.
And so I've just always am fascinated with the decision-making behind this. What made you not want to make it a movie? What led to landing on a short series versus a traditional film?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we had originally approached it as a feature. But it was like there was so much more character and story that we wanted to tell, particularly the story of the Panthers, Huey's backstory. And in a 2-hour format, it just started to get crowded out by all the caper stuff. But in a longer format, 6 hours, 8 hours, we saw that we could sort of, I don't know if you've seen Escape from Dannemora, but sort of use the caper as a thin level of story at the top, and then use, but most of it is about these people and these characters and their relationships. So it just seemed like a limited series was a better format to do that.
Well, talk about the relationship, though, between Bert Schneider and Huey Newton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Bert saw Huey and was like, this is a guy who had discovered Jack Nicholson in Easy Rider. And he was famous for sort of supporting talent and letting them do what they wanted to do. He never went to set, famously. And he saw Huey, he's like, that guy's a star. And he aggressively tried to seek out Huey and try to get involved with the Panthers. He wanted to give them money. Huey was wary of him at first, but ultimately they did start to work together. And Burt would, write checks for Panther programs and sort of stay out of the way, like he did with his movie productions, and the friendship blossomed from there. They stayed, friends, very close friends until Huey died. Mm-hmm. Burt was in his wedding, and it was a close personal friendship.
Well, tell us about the tale of, and what just give us a little bit of a tease of what someone who watches the Big Cigar, what they will see, and what this story is all about.
Yeah, it to me, the thing that's cool about it is a portrait, a nuanced, I think, portrait of a revolutionary in crisis, which is something that you don't see often. I don't like to do hagiography. Like, I don't think it's helpful for people to see perfect people do incredible things. I think it's helpful to see people that have human issues like we all do incredible things, because then you can do something too. And Huey, he spent 3 years in solitary confinement, which we now know is a form of torture, for shooting a police officer who shot him. And the conviction was ultimately overturned, but he comes out of prison. He has all this probably PTSD. He's an instant international celebrity, which he wasn't when he went in. And the FBI is pursuing him 24/7, basically trying to kill him. But, and it's sort of a slow motion assassination attempt where they didn't just walk up to him and shoot him, but they tried to drive him insane. They pitted Panthers against each other. They wrote fake letters between leaders and made phony phone calls from rival factions. We're going to get you. They bought the apartment next door. They would break in, all the time and wake him up with a gun in his face. They staged this shootout in the hallway of his apartment building to try to draw him out to shoot him. So it was just this constant, like someone's trying to kill you, and it's the federal government with the full force and resources of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover personally targeting you. And they ultimately were able to charge him with this murder, and he'd become friends with Burt and with nowhere else to go. And that's part of the success of COINTELPRO. It cut him off of all of his allies in the movement, and locally in Oakland, where he didn't know how to trust. He had a safe haven in Hollywood, and he fled there. They bulldozed the car and hit him out, and ultimately hatched this plot of getting him to Cuba under the guise of making a movie. And they all had code names. This guy's the producer, that guy's the director, Huey is the packager, the star, and the story is about how the producer got the star to Big Cigar, aka Cuba, without landing in the pokey. But there's a shootout that was real in Cantor's Deli. They hired a pilot to, like, somebody's drug dealer who was known for making runs to South America, to build an airstrip and fly him to Huey. But the guy pocketed the money and tipped off the mob, who already had a hit out on Huey. So they came down to Hollywood and took a shot. They hired a boat, and I don't want to get into too much what happened with the boat, but it will blow your mind when you see it. But that's all true. It's just a series of, like, any production, things went, especially when you're dealing with 70s Hollywood, things are going crazy. Yeah. These guys are putting out fires, and Huey at the same time dealing with, what I loved about the story is he's at a crossroads in his life where he really has to reevaluate everything and get back on the beam, because he had made a pivot from, you're used to seeing the Black Panthers. You look on Google, you're going to find a bunch of images of guys with guns. But what you don't see is that they were getting up at 5 a.m. every day and feeding Oakland school children in a program that's still in operation and feeds millions of kids. You don't see that they built housing and education and hospitals and ambulance service. They built a factory for clothes and food. And so that's what he had pivoted to. And that is why the FBI declared war on him, not because of the guns, but because he was doing these programs and they saw these programs could work and people were going to want change. And so they declared war on him before he could, usher in this revolution that he was talking about.
Right.
They saw it was real and that he could do it.
Jim,
and they tried to break him.
Before we move on, Jim, I do want to ask you on the Big Cigar and telling Huey Newton's story. I mean, why do you think it hasn't been done before? Like, he's a really interesting individual.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like at least 450 years of history beyond that question.
Fair.
I think it's heartbreaking, that there hasn't been a Huey Newton movie. That there's a lot more story to tell, and somebody should do the 8-season Panthers, Game of Thrones, gigantic epic series about everything that they did. I think it is, it's hard to get stories around people of color made. Then you have other dirty words like politics and people don't want to do political and period. And, it's just, those are things that I think are turnoffs.
How was it hard for you? How hard was it for you to get this done?
I've been working on this for 25 years. Like I said, this was my thesis project at USC. So, yeah, I mean, it's been, it all came out of a personal bottom for me where I had this conversation with myself, which was like, you can no longer do stuff that you like anymore, just do stuff that you love. And you can't try to make shows that you think people want to watch anymore. You have to make the show that you would want to see. And that led to, I think it was the day after that self-conversation that I found the book that became Winning Time. And then people were like, what else do you want to do? And I was like, this is the story I want to do more than anything else.
As you've mentioned, 25 years in the making, you cast Andre Holland to play Huey. What went into the casting process, again, given the length of time it's taken you to get this across the finish line, and what stood out about Andre?
Well, that's it. I mean, I thought that's the one person that should do this. Like, I watched Andre in The Knick. I think that's the first time I really became, aware of what he could do. And I think he's one of the greatest actors living today. I don't know anybody that I would say is better. And I mean that. And not only was he is breathtaking in this role. He is incredible. And not only was he incredible on camera, but working with him, he fought tooth and nail to make sure we got it right, to make sure that the perspective stayed with Huey, to make sure that we didn't dip into any tropes. I mean, Andre was in the details and is just an incredible creative partner and an inspiring actor to work with. And we were blessed. So when his agent called and said, what about Andre Holland? I was like, you don't have to, like, that's it. There's a list of one. That's the guy I want.
And Jim, I'm a big fan of nonfiction. When you're working with stories based in reality and you're trying to hold them up, it's kind of like what we do in journalism. How does that impact your ability to stick to a script and make sure that you're delivering what actually happened and not kind of fraying too far into reading between the lines or kind of implying what could or could have happened?
In this one, we felt more of a responsibility to stick as close to the truth as we absolutely could. In certain cases, we had to combine scenes just because of budget, basically, because we wanted to portray certain things. We didn't want to lose them. And we wanted to, I think your guiding principle is stick to the capital T truth of the story that you're trying to tell and the characters that you're representing. There were like a few things that I'll give you one example. Like, we had a bombing. There's a bombing portrayed in one of the social programs. And I don't know that went down that way, but it is reflective of the measures that people took at the time against the Panthers. Like A-Trap Brown's car was bombed. Fred Hampton was shot in bed. It is indicative of the kind of things that happened. And so we wanted to portray that they were opening this thing, and B, also get across the measures that the FBI took against the Panthers and COINTELPRO, and that this was indicative of the kind of things that they did.
What did you learn in the process? This is obviously someone that you, like as you said, did your thesis, you knew a lot about, obviously, knew the subject, the history, but what did you learn in the process, Jim?
Oh my God, that is a great question. I mean, well, first of all, when I first became attracted to the story, I was sort of, and this is an overshare for television, radio, I was sort of in the midst of becoming an addict myself. And so I was attracted to certain elements of 70s Hollywood that I thought were heroic or really cool. And I got sober in 2001. So in the 22 years that followed, my perspective on this story has shifted a lot, because I do think these are two incredible people who were derailed by addiction, and mental health not being the topic that it was in the early 70s, particularly for men. You can just kind of, see the way that the insidiousness of addiction and mental illness sort of took away two great thinkers from our times. I just think you don't know what you don't know. I came into this as someone who studied a lot of radical politics, and just every day was a constant, checking of yourself of what tropes are you bringing to this process? Like, how are you thinking about things? And I think when you consider yourself as sort of like, for lack of a better word, liberal kind of a person,
right? It's
surprising at first to see how much is, of your own thinking is out of line and needs, a little bit of a step back. And fortunately, I worked with people that could explain things to me, in a way that it was just a constant learning. Every day was a learning experience. And that's part of the great thing about this artistic process on this show is like, I didn't even know how much it was going to be like putting myself out there. Like people are going to see what you think when you pick up a pen and start writing.
Well, I think it's safe to say that the last few years and really coming off the pandemic and just things that we continue to learn about our history as a nation and just people in general, like things that we just actually don't know a lot about. And so it's this series and other things that really kind of help fill in some of the gaps and have these conversations like you've been having, it sounds like, with yourself. Jim, so fun to get some time with you. Good luck with it. Jim Hecht, creator of the Big Cigar. Catch it because it is making its debut on Friday on Apple TV+. Jim, take care. Jim joining us there in LA.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
What to see at the Biennale in Venice this year? Cassette tapes are back. Who knew? And the 2025 Aston Martin Vantage, I guess it said. Am I saying it right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Carol, I guess you can have one. If you said it right, so we'll get you one of those vehicles. Hey, also tasting notes in stemless wine glasses. And no, we're not talking about a vineyard, but instead the Napa Valley of beer. It's all in this week's Pursuits. Here with more, the editor of Bloomberg Pursuits, Chris Rouser. Chris, that's exactly where I want to start. This idea that...
I knew it.
You knew it. What I love about this story is it's all about taking sort of a wine approach to beer in this day and age. The idea of being at a vineyard, but you're at a brewery.
Yeah, the original pitch for the story was the winification of beer, which is the idea being like you go to a place where terroir is much more present when you experience the beer. It's also a leisurely experience, so you go to a tasting room, you maybe have some food paired with it, you hang out all day, and in the Hudson Valley, there are a bunch of breweries that are really taking the Napa Valley approach and creating this kind of environment. So you come, you're in a special place, you get to see where the plants grow, and you get to taste the stuff that's made on the land, and it just really gives you a full sense of the products. Many of us live in cities, so we think of a brewery as like a bar,
right,
that you go to and has a million taps and like a chalkboard that has a million beers that you don't really understand what the difference between any of the beers are. And then this is like you're there with the brewers, with the farmers, with the people who make it. You can look out over the field and see the apple orchards and the pear orchards that they use the fruit to mix into the brew.
That's what I love.
Yeah.
How they're doing it, right? Like they're like cherries, peaches, blueberries, honey from the beehives. I mean, and there was some like interesting little law, right, or something.
Yeah. So this is happening in New York State. This is actually happening all over, but we're talking about New York State, which actually sort of in the southern Hudson Valley is creating kind of a little bit of an informal tour, like a trail where you can go from brewery to brewery and people will recommend which one you go to next. You can spend a couple of days doing it. And the reason that this has been growing is because in 2013, the state passed legislation that allowed brewers to serve consumers directly, which means like you were at the brewery, they serve you a beer, which they didn't used to be able to do. They could sell you bottles, but they couldn't serve you. And if the ingredients for the beers were largely local by the year 2019. So the law passed in 2013. If you could get to more than 60% local ingredients by 2019, then you can start serving people. And so that's why people started building these tasting rooms, and a lot of people did it. And it also influenced local ingredients and, growing stuff on your own farm.
Who knew about these laws?
You're the beer dude.
I like beer.
How much do you experiment in like different? Like I love the idea of like fruits and honey and all this different stuff.
Yeah, what I like about this is it's less about sort of the high alcohol IPAs that have been so popular for so many years, and like just getting that bitterness there. But there's a lot of variation here. And I think that's really cool. Like farmhouse ales, saisons, like that's the good stuff.
Style.
Yeah.
And what's funny to me is I'm not a beer person, but I've learned a lot about beer over the past 10 years. And I just love that like when you taste like a peach inflected beer, it's because they literally threw peaches in the vat during brewing. It's not like wine. It's not more complex than that.
It's not like wine where people say they taste that stuff. Yeah.
It literally is. They just threw a bunch of blueberries in or maple syrup. And that makes it really interesting and really fun and more accessible than wine in a lot of ways.
Does it seem like this is taking off, Chris, the idea of creating this kind of ale trail, sort of similar to what we have in Napa Valley in California or maybe what we have in Kentucky when it comes to the Bourbon Trail?
It isn't formalized yet. So the State Tourism Agency does have like pamphlets that list about 90 breweries, but there isn't like a trail where you can check off where you've been. So our writer, Tony Rehagen, talked to brewers and they basically told him like, go here next. And that's how he found like his little route. And we put a map of it in the magazine. So
there's still a little choose your own adventure at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
I love it. I just love the history and just the idea that this is kind of like growing up and it's just a few hours outside New York City.
Are you a beer person at all, Carol?
I grew up actually, my dad and my brothers, and he liked ale. So absolutely. And you don't necessarily have to go to Venice to appreciate, though.
I was going to say, you don't have to be an artist to appreciate art.
All right. Yeah. Better. You won. Listen, you guys, I love you take us everywhere. And the very big art exhibition that happens in Venice, I know James Tarmy loves to cover it and talk about it. Just give us an overview and just remind us of what this is all about, why it's so important to the art world.
So if you don't feel like sitting at a picnic bench in a field in upstate New York having a beer, you can go to Venice and go to a giant cathedral and see some absolutely new cutting-edge contemporary art. So this year is the year of the Venice Biennale, which is every 2 years. James calls it the most important event in contemporary art, and a lot of people regard it that way. And it's technically a giant show every year that has different themes and different curators. Has 331 artists. That's the central show, which is called Foreigners Everywhere this year. But then like 30 different countries have pavilions.
That's really cool.
Where they bring a primary artist who does a show. Yeah. So the U.S. artist this year is Jeffrey Gibson, who's an indigenous artist. There's these 30 pavilions. And then through the rest of the city, there's just all these other ancillary installations and exhibits. And it's way too much honestly, to see all of it. But James went during the early days, saw a bunch of it, and basically picked out his favorite things to see. You know, it's very cool. You see these old palaces with Tintorettos on the ceiling, and then on the ground there's like a gold cube, and you have to figure out what it is, what the art is. You know. So anyway, so James has a great list of stuff to see while you're there.
We got to talk cassettes.
I want to talk.
They're
cassette
back?
tapes. Well, Chris, when you and I were youngsters, because we're about the same vintage, we made mixtapes, I'm guessing.
Oh, yes. Many. I still have many of them.
I do too.
I don't have a player.
That's exactly what I was going to say. And then a few years ago, my brother, who's like, I guess he's considered like a young millennial.
Okay.
He started having cassettes of like bands in his car.
Oh, yeah.
And he drove me around. I was like, why do you have tapes here? He's like, oh, like everybody's releasing tapes now.
Does he have a pencil to rewind the tape if the tape?
I have no idea.
So
what he's doing, but he was like born ahead. Like he was born after tapes were a thing. Yeah.
So artists are still making tapes. Like record labels still make tapes. So when Taylor Swift released the Tortured Poets Department,
heard of it?
Yeah. They sold 1.6 million physical units. So that's records, CDs, and cassette tapes. She sold 21,000 cassette tapes, which is nothing compared to the 750,000 CDs she sold. But that's a lot. 21,000 kids, Taylor Swift fans, bought cassettes.
So why are they doing this?
Because people really like owning a physical part of the artist's project. And, you know, vinyl has been back for a long time. You know, record store owners were not surprised that vinyl came back because people loved it so much. And they weren't even really surprised that cassettes came back because it's portable and it's less expensive. A vinyl album can cost like $30. A cassette tape can cost you less than $10. But you feel like you're carrying around a piece of your artist. And what's been surprising to these record store owners is that it's young people that are buying these, not like geriatric millennials like us who used to run around with their Sony Walkmans, but actually kids who are just like, it's sort of a secondhand nostalgia and they want to be a part of the project.
What are they playing them on?
Good question.
It's a really good question. So this story that we do by Matt Kronsberg, who's our gadget guy, we talk about 3 of the devices. So there's the We Are Rewind player, which actually has Bluetooth headphones. So it's a little like digital analog, but it has an input jack so you can record mixtapes like we used to do. And it even comes with a little pencil to sort of try to fix your tape if you screw it up. There's a Japanese company, FiO, that makes a CP13. And then Retrospect, which is a vintagey company that we've covered before. They make vintage like cameras and stuff and tape players. They have a CP81, which has like vintagey headphones, and you can record on it. So there's a lot of devices, and they're like in the $100 range.
I like that it comes with a pencil, as if it anticipates that there will be issues with this medium.
It's not if, but when.
Yes.
Yeah. There's always going to be an issue. Just quickly, the Vantage that Hannah Elliott, Aston Martin reviewed, liked it, but
it was great, but sometimes great is not good enough.
Exactly.
So the Aston Martin Vantage is inarguably like a really great car. It's a coupe. It's $191,000. It's very powerful, very fast. But Aston Martin really is not doing great. And Hannah is great at looking at this kind of stuff. Like they've been having trouble over the past few years. And what they really need is a product that will beat like Porsche and Mercedes, their cars that are in the same class, like the 911 Turbo. And this one just is not it.
You could feel it. You could feel it.
Yeah, it was like herky-jerking around. Like she felt like it was, it doesn't have real steering. She felt like it was like figure skating with a heavy backpack, which is so evocative. I was like, I've never done that, but I know exactly what you mean.
Not great.
We got to talk sunglasses.
Go there, baby.
Okay, because it's spring, it's going to be summer soon, but apparently there's like a new style of sunglasses thanks to what some pretty famous actors wore on the red carpet.
Yeah, so the new trend in sunglasses is sunglasses where you can see the eyes through the sunglasses. So not so tinted that you can't see through.
I like hiding behind the dark.
Well, I also like, especially if I feel tired, like today, I love wearing the sunglasses, but I'm totally face blind when people wear sunglasses. I will not recognize my best friend, Carol, as she's walking down the street if she's wearing sunglasses.
This is true.
So I do appreciate
this. It's amazing, right.
So we have the one this week is a pair of sunglasses. They're not cheap. They're $820 sunglasses. And they come from a brand called Jacques-Marie Maget, and they're called the Sandro lenses.
Can I tell a story real quick? Chris really is face blind.
Why? What happened?
When I was on parental leave,
Did you really?
No, I actually became close friends with one of his good friends, unbeknownst to Chris. And we sent Chris a photo of the two of us. And I was wearing contacts, and I usually wear glasses, but I was wearing contacts. And Chris texted back to our mutual friend, "Good picture, but who is that?"
I said, "Am I supposed to know who that man is?"
And it was me. And Chris and I have worked together for years. And I was like, and I just told this guy, "Hey, I love Chris. We record every week." And then I looked like an idiot because. So Chris really is face blind.
I am. I thought maybe he was. I literally was like, I thought he might be like a professional athlete that you were excited to be standing next to.
Thank you. I take that as a compliment.
All right. Well said. Well said. I'm glad we did that story. All right. Chris, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you guys.
That's the editor of Bloomberg Pursuits. Also, can I say this? Like our favorite dude around, Chris Rouser.
It makes me so happy. You can like we look forward to this. You have no idea.
This is the Bloomberg Business Week podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business App. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.